Hello, I'm Sue McKenna. I'm sorry that I'm not with you for this session. I'm away in Cape Town, but thank you very much to my Churchill colleagues for letting me send this video and doing it in this format. I'm going to be chatting about a whole range of issues, and I just hope that there's some kind of coherence in the process. And I'll just throw out the odd question that I hope will stimulate discussion after the video. And yes, I am filming this from my bed on a Sunday afternoon, so if you can see my pillows and my headboard in the background, yeah, that explains it. I think most of my presentation is based on the chapter that I wrote for the book that Lynn Quinn edited, and I'm sure that Lynn and Joanne or whoever's in the room can introduce you to that book, which is really, I think, a very useful resource and looks at academic development mostly from the perspective of Rhodes University, but also from a national perspective. And in my chapter, which was entitled Interrogating the Academic Project, I had a look at some of the issues that I'm going to be talking about now. So I'd like to begin by asking a simple question, or what I think is a simple question, and that is, what is an academic? What is it that she does that makes her an academic as opposed to a teacher or a lecturer? What is the academic nature of the work and of her identity? And is this work of the academic the same across significant differences that we experience? Very, very different kinds of institutions in our country. Is being an academic the same thing in those different institutions? Different disciplinary norms. Is being an academic in the physics department the same as being an academic in a dental technology department? And is that the same as being an academic in a journalism department? Different student bodies. Our universities have very different student bodies in terms of our students' prior schooling experiences, for example. And what are the implications of that? And then we also have differences in terms of our historical contexts of our universities. And although apartheid's been over for 2 decades, we can still quite visibly see the histories of our institutions, not just in the physical spaces, the geographical settings, but also in terms of a lot of the cultures and understandings of those institutions. So what is it to be an academic across all of these differences? And it's my contention that if we look at academic development with any assumptions of a shared uniform academic identity, then we would come at it with assumptions that there must be a shared uniform generic best practice of teaching and learning. I think that if we did that, it would be a mistake. It would be a mistake that would simplify matters, that would hide real issues of context. And yet I think it is the dominant discourse. When you look at academic development, we see in the scholarship of teaching and learning literature, there's a dominant idea that there is a best practice out there, and that our job as academic developers is to help academics to somehow achieve this best practice. And with those ideas comes a very technicist approach to academic development, a kind of training idea that our job is to work with academics to perform their jobs, perform their roles better by training them in these generic best practices. And I would argue instead that our job as academic developers is to provide theorized spaces to trouble dominant discourses, theorized spaces to interrogate what the academic project is, who it is for, who it is serving, who it is leaving out, and so on. In South Africa, the dominant understanding of quality that we've adopted through the Council on Higher Education publications, for example, is that of fitness of purpose and fitness for purpose. And this is the idea that in order to achieve quality, we need to have a very clear sense of what our purpose is. In other words, is it a fit purpose? And having thought about what our purpose is, we need to think clearly about what we need to do and be in order to be fit and healthy for that purpose. And I think that if we look at academic development and we start to raise the questions I'm suggesting about who is an academic, what is the academic project, who is it serving, then we start to understand that academic development is not about training in order to ensure the sufficient performance, but it's rather, as I said, about providing these theorized spaces. When we're working in South Africa, we know South Africa is a very unequal society. It's replete with injustices of various kinds. So if the purpose was fit, in other words, healthy and strong, that purpose would be one that very clearly looks at that context of injustice and inequality and says, what do we need to be as a university to be addressing this social context, and how should we teach in ways that fit with this context and address this context of inequality? How do we research? What do we research? How do we behave as researchers in ways that attend to these problems in our context? And so I argue that academic development's primary role in the university is to facilitate these kinds of consideration. So that's kind of my framing of academic development, and now I'm going to jump backwards and start looking at some of the sort of historical context from which these debates emanate. So as we know, in 1994, apartheid comes to an end, at least in terms of its legal structures. And at this time, the higher education system was very fractured, very uneven, very divided. We had the old binary division of the technikons on the one hand and the universities in another. They worked quite separately, very different histories, with often very little communication between them. So we had the South African University Vice Chancellor Association on the one hand, and we had the Committee of Technikon Principals on the other hand. So they really were functioning quite differently. They were also managed quite differently by the government. And although this might seem like ancient history, these legacies still exist and still have effect in certain ways. So for example, technikons had they were national diplomas. They didn't offer their own qualifications as such. They had to offer a nationally approved curriculum with very preset subjects, broad outlines of the content for those subjects, and they all had to be offered in the exact same way. And so there was a convenership system by which all the technikons offering that subject would communicate, and one technikon would be in charge of developing the central national diploma curriculum, which then had to be approved by government, because government's purpose in having the technikons was very much to provide skilled labour. So the technikons had a very strong outward focus on industry and attending to industry's immediate needs, and the curriculum needed to reflect that, which would include things like what used to be called cooperative learning, now called work-integrated learning. And so there was a much stronger state control of the curriculum in technikons. And this legacy continues because there isn't a strong curriculum development ethos amongst a lot of technikon academics. And this is something that in the University of Technology sector is being developed. Another difference between the technikon and the universities was the way in which funding happened. Funding was much more tightly managed in the technikon sector, centrally managed by the state. Universities had more freedom. So these kinds of differences. Oh, and also technikons had CERTEC system of quality assurance, whereas the universities had a much more autonomy in terms of doing their own quality assurance. Now, of course, the whole higher education sector is managed under the Council for Higher Education, which has a shared, exactly the same quality system across all institutional types, but these legacies are still evident. Making things more complex, in South Africa we don't only have differentiations of institutional type, which is a very common phenomenon around the world, where different kinds of institutions provide different types of qualifications and attend to slightly different kinds of knowledge structure. But in South Africa, we also have the differentiation of race, because under apartheid, our universities were constructed quite differently to attend to different racial categories. And that's had an enormous impact on how universities function to this day. As you know, we had white institute universities, Indian universities, coloured universities, and black African universities. And these were constructed very, very differently with very different goals. And we can see that in a lot of the policy documents of the time. So black universities were constructed to attend to high order skills needs. They were not constructed as spaces of critical engagement. Of course, we know critical engagement happened in those spaces, and in fact, strong anti-apartheid resistance was grown within those universities, but they were not constructed as spaces of criticality. They were constructed as spaces of developing very particular high administrative needs for the Bantu education system, for example, Bantu administration system. And most of the black universities were placed in rural contexts because, of course, we had the system of Group Areas Act, and we also had the system of homelands. And so these what are now historically black universities are often quite far out of the urban area, and that has consequences for institutional ethos and provides a certain set of constraints for those universities to this day. And the universities were, again, much like the technikons, the black universities were much more tightly managed in terms of funding. They were allocated a very clear budget every year. It was use it or lose it. You weren't allowed to invest money. They weren't allowed to save money. They weren't allowed to build money year on year. They got an allocation for the year and they had to use it up. And there were all sorts of restrictions on that. And the student body who was allowed to be admitted into the different universities was tightly restricted. The program qualification mix, in other words, universities didn't have autonomy to decide what courses they wanted to offer. The historically black universities were told what they had to offer, and staffing was restricted. And so if you had a so-called troublemaker staff member, the government could insist that you fire that person. These legacies are evident even though we've had attempts to try and change this very uneven landscape after apartheid, and they play out in all sorts of ways. And I think people working in academic development need to take the current context into account, to try and understand the current context and to understand where that context comes from historically. But of course, in 1994 there was a very clear need to get a single coherent system of higher education that would serve all South Africans equally. This was a time of transition, as you know, a volatile time, and it was a negotiated settlement, which really meant that in exchange for not having civil war, everyone had to compromise. And I think that's important to note, that there were very strong voices at the time of transition who wanted higher education to perform very specific transformation functions, but other voices, perhaps more conservative in their understanding of what the university should do in society, pulled back. And as with every other sector of society, compromises were made. For example, at the time we had quite strong voices from unions calling for the universities to be spaces of skills development. So really seeing it as a space of training, high order training, so that it would be a space of making sure that people could get jobs, employment. But then you had the sort of very political movement, which was sometimes associated with trade unions, sometimes not, such as People's Education, which saw universities very much not that they didn't see universities as preparing students for employment, but they saw universities very much as spaces of social redress, spaces where we could really imagine a new post-racial society. So there was a bit of a tension between the discourses that were calling for capitalist expansion, calling for universities as sort of spaces of globalization, and others seeing universities as playing a very important public interest public good role in transforming society. And then, of course, very conservative views of seeing universities maintaining the status quo and working for social reproduction of the elites in society. We've seen a lot of policies through these years. What the NEPI paper of 1992, the White Paper of 1997, both of those very much promoting massification in higher education, speaking about opening the doors of higher education, speaking about massively increasing the numbers so that universities would be a place where the strategy for equity could be played out by significant shifts in student demographics. And then we got the SAQA Act of 1995 and all the various SAQA machinery kind of coming into place. And this SAQA, the South African Qualifications Authority, it doesn't just focus on higher education, it focuses on all qualifications and very much focused on capitalist expansion, focused on the idea that education in all its various forms, whether it's in industry, whether it's in university, education has a real role to play in terms of providing high-level skills for better employment, for economic growth, and so on. And then very significantly, after 2004, we had the mergers. So we had these divides, the binary divide of Technikon and university, and we'd had the racial divides of black universities, coloured universities, Indian universities, and white universities. So there's two different kinds of differentiation of type, differentiation of history. And there was a desire through mergers of institutions to kind of disrupt that uneven landscape and bring about, hopefully, a more equitable set of institutions. And there was a lot of debate about whether the mergers would actually succeed in this, and it's certainly still debatable whether they did succeed or whether, in fact, the uneven higher education landscape is still evident even post-mergers. There's a lot of argument that, in fact, the mergers reinforced some of the sort of different status levels of different institutions. Nonetheless, they did happen, and we went from 36 public higher education institutions down to 23 through a series of mergers, some of which were very simple, like the one I was involved in, Technikon Natal and ML Salton Technikon. These two institutions were divided by a simple little wire fence. I mean, we shared car parks. It really was a nonsense of apartheid to have them separately right next to each other. But some other mergers were geographically much more complex, and to this day we have institutions with campuses that are hundreds of kilometers apart. You'll see on the slide it says 23 plus 3, because after the mergers down to 23, we've since then had 3 new institutions formed. So we've got the Mpumalanga University, we've got the new Solplaki University, and then we've got Sefako Makgato University, which was Madunsa, then became part of University of Limpopo, and now they've de-merged to make it a separate institution again. And all of these 23 plus 3 universities fit into now at 3 different types of institutions. We've got the traditional university, which primarily offers what are known as formative and professional degrees, and which have got a strong postgraduate sector. We've got the universities of technology, which are meant to focus primarily on high-level vocational qualifications, mainly diplomas, and have a very small postgraduate sector. And then we've got the comprehensive institutions, which are kind of a bit of both, a bit of traditional universities and a bit of University of Technology. In 2013, we had the White Paper on Post-School Education, which speaks to the need for there to be a continuum of post-school opportunities, which also focuses very strongly on the TVET colleges, which have been previously known as the FET colleges or the technical colleges, and a real attempt now to build that sector. In South Africa, we've always had what's known as the upside down or the inverse pyramid, where ideally what you want to have is a pyramid based on the bulk of your post-school education being at a vocational skills type, and then those who want to study further, making their way into the traditional. But we've got it the other way around, where we've got very few students in TVET colleges. And we see this, the consequence of this, in the lack of skills that we need in terms of all sorts of practical things like road building and plumbing, electricians. We have dire shortages. We've got the National Development Plan, which speaks about the need for growth in higher education again. And then we also have the Higher Education Qualifications Sub-Framework, which are the top 5 layers of the 10-level National Qualifications Framework. And those top 5 are the qualifications that we offer in our university sector, and they go all the way from certificates, diplomas, degrees, honours, postgraduate diplomas, masters, and at the very top level, the doctorate. So these policies have all come in, and there have been shifts within these policies. So in a lot of the earlier policies, especially that first white paper, we saw a strong language of transformation, social equity, a strong sense that higher education would be performing that role. In later papers, I would argue that the language has been far more in terms of the role of higher education as shifting efficiency. So often you hear of this as referred to as the tension between equity and efficiency. Now, of course, many, such as Salim Badat, have argued that we can attend to both at the same time, and these don't need to be in conflict. But there certainly is I'd say, a tension between them. So the government put in place after 1994 3 big steering mechanisms as a way of kind of pushing the university sector to achieve the goals that it's set for the sector. Our Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, Chapter 2 of our Constitution, speaks about academic freedom. It's the only constitution in the world that directly addresses the idea of academic freedom. And I think there's a lot of debate to be had about what that means, and the relationship between academic freedom and institutional autonomy, but I won't go into that now. But suffice to say that I think the writers of the Constitution held it as very important that universities should have an autonomy from the state, that universities should be spaces where we can develop a kind of critical capacity to interrogate what the government's doing, even to critique what the government's doing, and that if the universities were too tightly aligned to the state, they won't be able to perform that role. And so we've got this idea of academic freedom in the Constitution. Nonetheless, we have a public higher education sector, which means that our universities are heavily subsidized by taxpayers. Now, the fees must fall debates that are happening at the moment raise questions about the extent of that subsidy, and indeed that subsidy has decreased over the last decade. So the percentage of money that universities have to run, it's the amount it relies on student fees has increased as student fees have gone up to make up the gap of the decrease of money that's come from the state. But nonetheless, taxpayers' funding is still an enormous part of how universities fund themselves. Anything from 1/3 to 1/2 of our money comes from the state. And I keep saying taxpayers to remind you that the government doesn't make any money whatsoever. So government doesn't make money, it merely distributes money from taxpayers. So when the state is funding universities about 1/3 to 1/2 of our income, they are distributing money that the average South African has paid in. So if we are being heavily subsidized by the state, it can be argued that the state, as a proxy for the taxpayers that are paying the money, has a right to know that we're spending that money wisely, and has a right to know that we are achieving the aims that are to the benefit of the country. And so there, again, there's a tension between the idea that universities need to be autonomous, need to be independent, need to have freedom to make their own decisions, to criticize the state, and on the other hand, the state has a right to say, well, we're funding you a heck of a lot of money, so we need to know that that money is being used wisely and is being used in ways that are aligned with what's expected of universities. And it's the state uses three main steering mechanisms to achieve that. It's got the Council on Higher Education and the subcommittee, which is the Higher Education Qualifications Committee, that does various quality processes. So all new programs have to get accredited and checked for quality. We have national reviews and audits and so on. Then it's got the funding formula, and money is a great way of making people do what you want them to. So the state has tried to use funding. For example, the funding formula has got quite a large performance-based portion. So although universities get funding for students as they register, what we crudely call bums on seat funding, there's quite a large portion that you only get when students cross the stage at graduation, so that there is an incentive to make sure students don't just get into the system, but they actually successfully get through it. And we have other aspects of the funding formula that are ring-fenced to try and push certain activities. So, for example, we've got the extended curricular funding, also known as foundation provision. We've got the teaching development grants and so on. I'll talk to you a bit more about that in a minute. And then the third way of sort of steering universities that the state has is the program qualifications mix, which is the list of qualifications, that list of programs that each university can offer for which it will get funding. So universities can't just willy-nilly offer any courses they want and then expect the state to subsidize them. They have to get permission to do so on the basis of what's seen as need for those courses in that area, on the basis of them having the correct facilities, library, laboratories, staffing, and so on. And then enrollment planning, that universities have to put in 5-year enrollment plans to show where they'll be growing and how and so on. And again, if you take too few students, less than what your enrollment plan said, you get penalized financially. And if you take far more than what you had planned on in terms of your enrollment plan, you'll get you'll lose some of your funding. So those are the mechanisms that the state can use to move universities in particular directions. So a lot of these, the mergers, the big interventions, these three steering mechanisms are very much around the idea of transforming and very unjust apartheid style higher education system. And there have been some successes, but there have also been some failures. And certainly the student protests have raised lots of questions about the extent of success of transforming the sector. In terms of equity of access, that, in other words, is it fair how people are able to get in to access higher education? We've had some success. We can see amazing shifts in demographics of students and amazing increases of numbers, and in particularly students who historically would not have been able to get into particular universities. So your historically white universities have seen enormous changes in terms of their student bodies. Not as significant a shift in terms of their staffing. And so that remains an important bone of contention. And then also, have we succeeded in terms of equity of outcomes? Not really. So we are certainly having a more diverse student population getting into the university. But at graduation, we see many of the old the history, the legacy of apartheid still evident. So success rates are racially differentiated in every university, in every faculty in South Africa. The ratio that white students and Indian students continue to be more likely to successfully complete a degree than their other student counterparts. So moving along, what is the role of academic development then, given all of this, given the injustices of society and the potential role that a university can play, given the need for economic growth and the potential role the university can play, given the need for shifts in staffing and students, given the questions raised about what knowledge and whose knowledge and for what that our student protests have raised, where does academic development fit into all of this? I think it's worth again looking at academic development as a structure within our universities and having a quick glimpse at the history of academic development. There's some really good readings on this, and I'm sure that you can be directed to those if you want to read a kind of history of academic development in South Africa. But I think it's important to note that academic development has had quite different structures and played quite different roles in different universities. So, for example, we've got the difference between those academic development centres or units that were very focused on students, that were very focused on initiatives intended on addressing problems in the student, deficiencies in the students, gaps in the students, needs in the students, extra English classes, remedial maths courses, and where the bulk of the academic development work was student focused. And then we had universities where the bulk of the academic development work was focused on staff. Who do staff need to be? How do they need to be? What practices will make them better at their jobs? Sometimes within a kind of very strong technical discourse of generic best practices, so teaching them the best skills to be the most efficient at their jobs, whereas sometimes the staff-focused academic development was much more critical, asking questions about the extent to which our universities are actually providing for the needs of our students, the extent to which our universities and our staff are aware of who our students are and what they bring with them. So even within these different approaches, there were quite different understandings of these approaches. And we also had some academic development focused on institution level, focused on policy development, focused on institutional level questions around ethos and culture and so on. Another distinction between academic development in South Africa that you'll be well familiar with is the extent to which there was a central unit in the institution, or the extent to which it was decentralized and there were academic development type people within the faculties and departments. And there have been a lot of sort of critiques of both of these models. The problem with a centralized model is often people, the academic developers, are talking to each other and working with each other, and perhaps not keeping as up to date with what's actually happening in the classrooms, with the experiences of lecturers, with the understandings of the disciplines. So a central unit can have the flaw of perhaps not truly understanding the lecture theatre, not truly understanding disciplinary norms and knowledge structures and the way those play out in teaching and learning. But on the other hand, the decentralized model, where you'd have one or two academic development type people in departments, has also got huge flaws. Often those people were unable to kind of build a critical mass to have a very strong voice in the institution. They often ended up being tutors, doing lots of extra marking, and really taking on quite remedial roles rather than having any kind of impact on the institution as a whole. And then, of course, another big issue was the extent to which people were hired as permanent academic development practitioners or on contract. And this has had an enormous effect on the extent to which academic development has gained credibility, has had a sort of a continuous language within an institution, because if you've got chopping and changing of staff, it's unlikely that you can build that kind of powerful position. Plus, the truth is that if you're hiring people on contract, it's really difficult to get very experienced, very qualified people. They are less likely to be willing to work on contract, and so you're less likely to get those people. And that adds to that final point, the issue of credibility within academic development units. Oftentimes, the way that they are positioned in the institution, both physically, their office space, but also discursively, the way that they are understood by deans and academics, is often not as powerful change agents as people who have got an important, significant input in helping the university move forward, but rather they are seen as people who can fix student problems, who can offer extra tutorials, who can sort of fill up gaps. And so this issue of credibility of academic development practitioners is a really significant one if it is a field that's going to have an impact in terms of taking higher education where it wants to go. one last set of points before I finish off, and that's to look at what funds academic development. In the very early days, it was mostly externally funded on small project grants, but it has been generally funded through universities' block grants over the years, and now there are some ring-fenced fundings for the extended curriculum programs, and then there's also the teaching development grant. The teaching development grant money is money set aside for all sorts of initiatives that are meant to build better teaching practice. And there's a similar research development grant, which is meant money set aside specifically to grow research ethos and research output in an institution. As from 2017, this year, there's no longer a TDG and a RDG. There's now what's called a UDG, which is the University Development Grant, which will be the two of those together, and it'll be up to universities to determine what they want to spend that money on, provided they can show that that money has been spent on things that will improve either teaching or research. So I think there may be some tensions within universities now as to whether that money gets spent on teaching-focused initiatives or on research-focused initiatives. And we are going into a time of serious financial squeeze. The fees must fall. Protests have certainly led to increases in state funding, but nowhere near as much as the decrease of income that's going to come from student funding, especially as we see more and more fee-paying students leaving the public sector and going into the privates. So we're going to go into an era of serious financial squeeze. Given that academic development should have a role to play in helping universities have these difficult conversations and think about how best they can serve the needs of the country, one would think that in a time of financial constraint, academic development can play a very significant role. But on the other hand, if there's only a certain amount of money available for posts, it may well be that academic development is seen as kind of a soft area and something that's relatively easy to cut. So I think we need to be aware of the fact of moving into a financially constrained time in higher education in South Africa, and having to really think through carefully how we are perceived in universities and how we are actually offering something that is meaningful to the university community. I'm going to end now with a series of questions for you, which I will leave you to discuss with the facilitators and with each other. And hopefully what I've said in the last half an hour has raised some other issues that maybe you've jotted down that you'd now like to discuss. I'm really sorry I can't be there with you for this. Thanks for listening to me. I hope the sound is okay, and I hope it wasn't too boring. And I hope you enjoy your conversations with each other now. Thank you. Bye.